Today is June 27th. We are recording this call as we do every week. Today we'll have a presentation by John on DNS, federated DNS. Before we get started I just wanted to give the SIG a general update as to what we've been doing the last few, weeks, months at Google. Every so often, Google hosts what we call a customer advisory board. And we have customers who come in, and then they tell us what problems they're trying to solve. And these are not necessarily our customers; these are users of Kubernetes in this case. So, what problems they're facing, and in this case, the topic of conversation was federation, multi-cluster. It turns out that what users are trying to solve is problems that kind of intersect federation in some areas, but are mostly I would put them under the umbrella of multi-cluster. I mean, it's not a full-on embrace of Federation API as it is, but they're still trying to figure out how to hook up clusters together. And they're using some of the features we have been proposing in Federation, and sometimes not. The deployments are not always, deployments of these clusters are sometimes independent, more like islands, and sometimes they're more fully connected, which is typically what at Google we would think of. But it's not unreasonable for users to think that in terms of multi-cluster and Kubernetes, they're really looking to this SIG to solve a lot of their issues. And it seems like there's a correlation to when we say Federation API is ready for prime time. It's on their end, they interpret it as multi-cluster is ready for prime time. But what we found from these users is that a lot of the times they're developing their own tooling as a result of just kind of waiting for Federation to be ready or be GA. And at the same time, on our end at Google, we've been looking at how we could bring what it would take for us to offer a product based on Federation. And there we hit a few challenges that we can list later on. But I think the important thing to remember is that while we're working trying to make Federation better, there's other people who have real problems that they need to solve in a multi-cluster setting today. Also in parallel, we have people in the field who help customers, and we realize they're developing their own tooling to do things that are done today in Federation, but these users can't adopt Federation because Federation is not ready yet. So you kind of have a list of some of these challenges. I can go through the list if we want. You'll find that, I mean, this list shouldn't be surprising to many people in the SIG. There's a lot of items that were listed even last weekend that are listed in the Federation engineering worksheet. Maru brought a lot of these up. But I think what's the prevalent point here is that the SIG has been mostly focused on, I guess, the bucket of APIs that would be Kube API related and integrating that into Federation, and not necessarily addressing more of the foundational points that really have to be solved before we can take Federation API to production. Some of these we've talked about. There are issues like annotations, but there are much bigger problems that users are facing today that I think should be discussed within this SIG. And these are not necessarily features per se, but they can be reference designs. So for example, in the area of authentication and authorization, a deployment of a federation across multiple clusters really has ramifications that go beyond a single cluster itself. And right now we don't have any reference design or really kind of a path forward to allow people to, for example, integrate with one external identity provider. There has been work, Nikhil started some of this work with SIG Auth, but it hasn't kind of flowed back into SIG Federation, and it seems like we're mostly focused on Kube API. I don't want to get bogged down on too many of these other challenges. I think there's a few more I could mention, but from here on, I think the other point is what do we want to do as a SIG? I mean, if Federation API is the way forward, I guess we want to know if we can capture all the user intent of what people want to do with federated clusters, and see maybe if a different API is really the way forward, or if we can reconcile all the issues with the current API. I mean, the other aspect is there are, I think, valuable pieces of technology that are available within Federation today. It's just we're in some unfortunate situation where we can't easily extract those pieces and allow users to leverage them without users wholly embracing the full Federation API model, which in some cases is not necessarily attractive or possible for all users. One that comes to mind is just cross-cluster service discovery, which in itself is not necessarily tied to Federation API, but it's a valuable piece of technology that's only kind of hidden under the hood of Federation API. Another example we'll get, I mean, John's work on federated DNS has a small dependency on the federated API controller, but as itself, as a solution, it seems like it could be adopted as a multi-cluster solution that sits in parallel with federated API. So as a SIG, and as a SIG that has the name SIG Federation, is it correct for us, or is it desirable for us to want to try to tackle what we think reflects multi-cluster use cases, things that customers are trying to solve today? So coming to Google because we are a cloud provider and we have technology with an advanced load balancer, a lot of customers say, we want to spin up clusters in different areas of the world. And one of our most important use cases is make sure that our customers have the lowest latency possible to a given microservice. And this is something right now that we can do in Federation, but again, you have to embrace the whole Federation API model. So we've developed kind of tools on the side, and to my surprise, even people in the field, these would be our field engineers, have developed their own tools to allow our customers to be able to do this. But this is mostly a use case oriented problem. I see it as being parallel to what Federation as an API wants to do. But this is something that we, for now, will have to focus on, because this is the users that we see, this is the problems they're trying to solve. I mean, there's others that I can list, but I guess this is the overall few points that we wanted to bring to the SIG, which would be, I mean, where our users are, what the challenges are. Again, I haven't gone through all of them. We've already discussed some of them, and maybe kind of opening it up to the SIG to see what we want to solve together, and how we want to partition this work. So we've kind of and thoughts. When
Sorry. So it sounds like what you're saying is that traditionally, and I've only been a little bit involved in Federation, so um, you know, I'm trying to get a handle on everything here. But it sounds like what you're saying is traditionally that the focus has been specifically on the Federation control plane, the KubeFed, and the associated API servers, and that you're thinking that the SIG should expand to general multi-cluster type of use cases as opposed to specifically focusing on one set of tooling.
That's right.
Yeah, so this is Steve Watt from Red Hat. I'm just trying to parse that. So basically, not necessarily use the Federation tools, but be able to document how to get things done with multiple clusters. Is that right?
I mean, I think there's a documentation component there, yes, but there's definitely also a tooling component, mainly because we've seen cases where users solve multi-cluster solutions, for example, we'll say deployments, but they may not want to have an automated controller do this in the background because it's a very delicate operation. So for them doing a deployment over multiple clusters, they want to retain more, I'll call it foreground control over what happens.
Okay.
So in this case, it seems to suggest that it's kind of a mix, right? It's a mix of maybe some of the operation can be done in a controller, but most of it seems to be in a foreground tool. At least I can think of 3 or 4 users that explicitly told us, we're never going to let a controller do this because we can't. This is too vital of an operation for us.
Got it.
That's one example.
So it's more like first figure out what the best practices are, and then if they're, if it makes sense, maybe just still tooling out of that. But maybe, I think you're passively saying, we had the cart in front of the horse here, where we started with the tooling and then try to construe the best practices, and we're going to step back first, construe what the best practices are, how we should go about this in the first place, and if that necessitates tooling, so be it. But start with the best practices. Is that right?
Yep, I think that's fair.
I think it might be worth just reiterating. I had a discussion with Christian and Mike, who I'm not sure if he's here today, a couple of days ago on this general topic, and sort of, I think, looking at how we got to where we got to. And then some of the stuff requires digging into the details of these particular use cases that have been highlighted as things that people perhaps can't do with Federation today, or want to do but don't want to use Federation, and how would they do that, etc. But before going into that, so originally there was an idea that we should perhaps build a separate API for Federation, different from the Kubernetes API, and which would specifically address multi-cluster use cases. And that actually, I think, originated from me. I actually read the document, and that was my proposal. And then some people pointed out to me that this introduces a fairly substantial learning curve for people who now have to learn potentially a different API with different set of abstractions and objects and things, or in a different version of that, the same named abstractions, but which actually work differently than the way they do in Kubernetes. And that was seen as potentially, when I say work differently, they have the same name, but they have a different actual API. So different set of fields, different status, different spec, etc. And I think Clayton's here today. I think he was one of the main proponents who successfully that a first step might be to start with the Kubernetes abstractions, because we've kind of thought about them fairly carefully in many cases, and people are familiar with them, and companies have built tooling around them. Start there and say, how many of these abstractions make sense, and then potentially implement them. And then the next step might be to say, right, now where do these things fall short? Where do they not do what people actually want to do in a multi-cluster scenario? and then augment those either with additional abstractions or by changing those abstractions in appropriate ways for, you know, specialized multi-cluster. So I guess where I'm going with all of this is, I personally think, and it wasn't my idea, it was actually mostly Clayton's idea, but I think it actually is a good one. And what might be appropriate at this point is to take these set of problems that we've come across through this advisory board and figure out in detail, because some of these things do require some detail. If we had a full Kubernetes API on Federation today, which we don't have, but we're fairly substantially there, modulo, you know, stuff being alpha and not stable and not finished yet, but other than that, if we had all that, how would people address these particular things that they're trying to do? And in cases where there is absolutely no solution to trying to solve, what is the most appropriate alternative? Is it building an external tool outside of Federation? Is it adding a new type, API type to the Federation API that does this multi-cluster specific thing? Or is it adding, for example, adding status fields or adding spec fields to fundamentally a Kubernetes abstraction that, you know, extends it to be more multi-cluster capable? Does that make sense?
And I'll add, I was going to add, like, I think the value that I've always seen in Federation as an abstraction is I can kubectl apply something that runs on one cluster and have it run successfully. If the concept doesn't make sense to apply to a Federation, then it should tell you it doesn't apply and that you need to design your app to take advantage of Federation. And there are many ways of making that work. But certainly there's then the corresponding thing, which is at some point the abstraction breaks down because, of course, you know, you may need to deal with 3 clusters as if they were 3 clusters. And that's where I think some of the challenges we're hitting today deal with for things like stateful set, as an example.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth stating that we absolutely envisaged. Whoa. Sorry, I've got a call coming in on my computer here. Let me try and get rid of it. I just want to say we absolutely envisaged running into these problems. We did not imagine that the pure Kubernetes API would actually work for all the multi-cluster cases, but we figured that we would figure out the details of that as we went along, rather than trying to anticipate all of the actual use cases of these things, because there were many, and many people had different ideas of how they would use Federation. I think that original document that I wrote outlined, you know, at least 5 or 6 general areas where this stuff is potentially useful. Multi-cloud provider case, there's hybrid cloud stuff, there's, you know, many, you know, there's the high availability stuff, there's many different areas. And so yeah, I mean, I guess where Christian says we've got to a point now where, you know, the implementation we have so far is not necessarily addressing the majority of the use cases, is not an unexpected place to have come to. I think we anticipated getting here. The question is, do we finish the Kubernetes API and get everything that is in that API to a point of being GA, and then, you know, go and extend it from there, or do we extend it before what is there and useful? And I think everyone accepts that there is some useful stuff there, maybe not packaged up in a format that people want it. Maybe they don't want to deploy a control plane, but they want to be able to do something like this from a command line tool. I think there are some challenges associated with that, but we can certainly try and solve specific problems that way. And yeah, I mean, the decision that we came to provisionally a few quarters ago was that, and this was a different customer advisory board, was that people would like us to GA the features we have before extending them much further. And we decided to do that, and those were largely the things that we had on the 1.7 and to a lesser extent 1.6 plan. And I think many of them go GA or even beta for that matter. So I think that, yeah, I mean, that's an execution problem rather than a trying to do the wrong things problem.
But Quentin, if I stop you there, like the list of work items that Maru added for 1.8 really are core foundational issues that have to be addressed in order for Federation as a product can be called GA. It's not sufficient to say that we have a handful of APIs that are beta or GA.
Oh, sure. No, I don't disagree. When I say beta or GA, I mean the APIs and the product. I mean, if the APIs are not stable, then we can't call them GA if we're not going to support them into the future. And if the infrastructure does not actually like work properly because it's got bugs in it or doesn't perform properly, then it's also not GA. So yes, there's two sets of problems to solve. Totally agreed. And we spent a lot of trouble, stabilizing some of the implementations in the past 6 to 9 months. We stabilized some of the APIs and things like security and the authentication issues that and I think we didn't get as far with some of those things as we would have liked to, particularly with and some of those things. And yeah, I think we just need to. I think if we had executed all the things that we planned to execute 6 months ago, we would possibly be less concerned than we are, maybe.
But don't you think there's a somewhat of a mismatch in terms of people want to consume nuggets of what is implemented in Federation, and the way that we're kind of developing things doesn't give them that opportunity. It's either, you can't have 1 foot in, 1 foot out. It's kind of you embrace the model or you don't. And if you do it halfway, which some people are doing, you have to be a pretty advanced user because it's very tricky to start playing with objects that are managed through the Federation plane and objects that are not.
Not quite sure what my opinion on that is, quite frankly. I guess we could, there's always been the ability to build automation outside of the Federation control plane. You can always, build a kind of a kube control type that does, rolling update across multiple clusters, or somehow programs your DNS to do a bunch of things across clusters. The problem is you've got to, in many cases, you end up needing something that is long running, that can actually monitor the status of things and make changes. That's kind of fundamental to the design of Kubernetes, this declarative model. So yeah, I guess we should perhaps go into the concrete cases where people want to take a piece of what Federation can do and use it without actually running a Federation control plane. That might be a useful exercise. And then we can figure out whether those things, as opposed to being sort of fuzzy, not particularly well thought out, aspirations, versus them being, concretely useful. And maybe my wording there was, I didn't mean to imply that I'm skeptical of it. I just, there is an aspirational idea that I would like to be able to do something, and then there is the actual concrete plan as to how that would work and whether in fact it's feasible when you go into the details. That is a worthwhile exercise to go through. And should it be the case that some of these things are useful outside of Federation, then maybe we can refactor the code or do whatever we need to do to turn them into libraries or command line tools or whatever else might be necessary to make the things usable. If we don't actually think that the end product of those, let's say command line tools that do some of the federation stuff is actually usable, then maybe that effort is not well spent. But it's a useful exercise, I think, to go through and decide which of the two approaches make sense.
Yeah, because we have that example that we had from 2 weeks ago. You asked about eBay, and I think the investment that they had made at the time was in cross-cluster service discovery, and that one seems to stand out as something that would be useful today. And there seems that should be a path forward to deploy it outside necessarily Federation API. It's an important feature.
So maybe I don't know if now's the right time to do it, but I guess we could dive into that in a little bit more detail,
right
here or another time. But it seems to me that to have cross-cluster service discovery, you need to have a long-running monitoring service that will figure out when clusters are up and down, and rejig whatever needs to be rejigged, either a load balancer or a DNS server to address those things. And that's kind of what the federated service controllers does. This one could, and it does that on the basis of configuration that you feed it via a API object. So it's not entirely clear to me how one might pull that usefulness out and deploy it in something that doesn't start looking very much like a federated service controller.
I don't think it's a service controller that's the issue. I think it's more that the current implementation relies on exposing the Kube API as via the Federation control plane, and then we run into the issues of version skew and how do we support different versions, and how do we upgrade, and so it's more the idea of just running a controller isn't really the issue. It's more how do people access that. And the current approach has so many issues that we haven't addressed yet.
Yeah, I see these as two different issues. One is the Federation API issue, where we've tied us to the Kubernetes API, and then there's the Federation architecture. And like you said, the architecture, there are some use cases where having a long-running controller use the Federation architecture does make sense, but the API especially is we are not in a good position by tying us to the Kubernetes API. So I at least view them as two different problems.
Yeah, and like I said before, I totally buy the idea that we may need to extend the Kubernetes API to cluster-specific either API objects or extensions to the existing API objects, and I don't think that has ever been taken off the table. The question is, do we want to start with ended, extensions to the Kubernetes objects? Or do we want to start with something, at least the base level, which is that we provide the Kubernetes API with all of its limitations with respect to multi-cluster, and then build from there? That's the question in my mind.
Right. I think that question, as a prototyping exercise, I think using the Kube API has been a huge win. It just sidesteps all of the supportability issues that really are critical for bringing something to customers as something you can support and provide as a product. And so, we've discussed this in the past. I think it's just, this is the time where we actually have to solve those problems. And that may mean that exposing Kubernetes API is not really a viable way to do it if we can't solve the issues that it causes.
Okay,
I'm sorry, do we want to get to the DNS proposal at some point? It's 10:04, we have another 26 minutes. This is interesting conversation, but we should probably start talking about the DNS proposal, or else I think we'll run out of time. Or
sure, has anybody read it? I've sort of reviewed and add my comments there.
Yes.
No, it says access.
Tree.
All right, I know a number of people have reviewed this already. I just put it in the group chat there for people to take a look. But just to quickly kind of give an overview, I guess first I'll start with a little bit about me and who I am and where I'm coming from this. I'm one of the maintainers, along with Meek Gibbon, one of the primary maintainers of Core DNS. And I work for Infoblox. We do DNS stuff. And Infoblox has sort of been the one who sponsored the integration between Core DNS and Kubernetes for the in-cluster DNS, not the with the Federation control plane, but for replacing the standard kubedns with Core DNS. I also am working internally in Infoblox. I'm leading the effort where we're going from our existing SaaS control plane, which is Mesos and Marathon, and moving that to Kubernetes. So that's how I'm involved here. We're not using Federation yet because, as we all know, it's not quite ready yet. But it is something we want to look at in the future. And so, as a maintainer of Core DNS, one of our goals is to make it more useful for everybody. And we thought that there were some opportunities within the Federation. Let's see, can I share my screen here? That we thought there were some opportunities here, that there may be some use cases that aren't, or some places where the idea of publishing CNAMEs to external public DNS may not work well, as well as some other issues. So some of the things we wanted to try and address, and I think Quentin has made the point that this shouldn't replace the existing solution, and I agree. There's cases where this doesn't work well, particularly at scale and in certain topologies where DNS runs everywhere on every host in the cluster, and I think OpenShift does that. But we do see in smaller sets of clusters that this may provide some additional opportunities for optimization. So in any case, the problems that we are trying to address were the requirement that there is an external DNS, programmable DNS provider, and that the existing sort of tree of CNAMEs approach, where we have CNAMEs to CNAMEs, and where it's a little bit complicated to explain, and there's no control over the specific IP address that gets delivered to the client once you've recursed out to that public DNS. You'll get that list of A records potentially that could be anywhere in the world. So a level picture here of what we're talking about. Fundamentally, in DNS, for those who aren't very familiar with it, there's a concept of a zone and a zone transfer. So a zone is just a domain, and the zone transfer is a way for a secondary DNS server to get the resource records, that is all the entries that are part of the zone, from the master, and hold on to that and serve it locally, so that typically it's used in DNS for redundancy or just for reducing latency by bringing something closer, that sort of thing. We can use this same mechanism or a similar mechanism, in this case though, by allowing each individual DNS service within each individual cluster to bring in via zone transfer all the records from each other cluster. So what this means is that when somebody does a lookup for a federated service, the local in-cluster DNS would do what it does today. It would look for a local one, and if it doesn't find one, rather than just recursing out or proxying out to the public DNS, it would instead look at the list of clusters which have that running in a federated mode across all the clusters, apply some policy, and then choose to return one of the IP addresses from one of those clusters. The basic idea is that each individual core DNS running in each individual cluster would put a watch on the clusters object in the Federation API, and as new clusters come and go, it would establish connections with them and solicit zone transfers in essence. So that's how we keep up to date. Some of the issues are around the user experience. We want to make sure that in general, this whole solution could be built completely in CoreDNS without any direct modifications to kubefed or anything like that. However, to make the user experience really, really simple and easy and slick, then that's where we would start looking at potential modifications to kubefed, where we allow kubefed to essentially set up in order to make this work, you need to expose DNS, which most people don't want to do. So to mitigate that, we expose DNS only with a gRPC connection. One of the things that the CoreDNS does that's a bit unusual is that it offers a way to get DNS records via gRPC over TLS. So the idea would be that when we expose that DNS entry, the DNS service rather, publicly, we do it only via the gRPC over TLS connection with some sort of potentially client certificate or potentially to avoid DOS type of things, you could put you could put policies on the load balancers. So what that means, though, is that each individual clustered CoreDNS needs to be aware of the others, aware of where their gRPC endpoints are, potentially have a certificate deployed to them, and of course we need to expose those. That something needs to expose the DNS over gRPC and coordinate that whole process. That's where we would see something being done in the Federation control plane or kubefed essentially. That's really the primary thing. The other concerns we talk about here in the document are, of course, this creates a mesh, and any mesh has an n-square scalability issue. So that's where larger sets of clusters could become an issue. And at that point, you either need to rendezvous somewhere, or essentially you end up looking very similar to what we have today in the Federation controller, maybe with some slight differences. So, that begs the question of whether we want to pursue this or not. But that's really it in short. I don't know if people have questions.
Yeah, I would say what I liked in this proposal was adding the nearness concept to CoreDNS, and CoreDNS getting to decide which cluster should it route to, rather than like today the service controller just configures all DNS providers. But I also, in the existing design, I like where the in-cluster DNS and cross-cluster DNS are separate, and if one crashes, it doesn't impact the other one, which we lose with this proposal. Yes, you do end up tying them together, but basically if in-cluster DNS crashes, you're in trouble anyway. So that's the issue I think Quentin brought up about potential of denial of service there. So we would have to see how we can mitigate that. I think there's a number of ways to do that, but there's also scenarios that are purely on-prem, which I know is where the CoreDNS is used today, generally when there's not a cloud DNS provider. And in those cases, that wouldn't really be such an issue either. So it's really an alternate. Actually, yeah, I'm not sure. Even in the on-prem scenario, we do have like CoreDNS as a implementation for external DNS provider, and you can continue to use KubeDNS as your internal DNS provider and CoreDNS as the cross-cluster DNS provider.
Oh yes, I realize that. What I was saying is that there are situations where the potential issue of denial of service goes away because you're on-prem, which is not. So this is an alternative way to do an on-prem installation as well, without setting up an etcd and having a stateful service running on-prem for that. So I guess my main point here is to solicit feedback. I've gotten quite a bit of good feedback in the document. And at this point, we're looking to pursue building this out. But unless people think it's completely off base, and we shouldn't waste our time. But I think that there's the idea of being able to inject policy, and this is something we're doing in the in-cluster DNS too, is at some point, we haven't gotten to it yet, where we'll be implementing the ability to use an external policy engine, either like the Open Policy Agent, I think I saw Torin's on here, or we have our own internal one that's open sourced, and to apply policy at the DNS layer in cluster, and of course this would allow you to do it also out of cluster. So that's for the federated services. That's where the nearness algorithm comes in.
Just wanted to add one comment, which I didn't actually get around to adding to the document, which is that the nearness algorithm stuff could also be implemented in the existing federation external DNS solution. So the current way it's implemented was just really a first pass at getting something semi-sensible, which assumes that in the same region are closer than clusters in different regions, etc. But there's no fundamental reason why that algorithm could not be made more sophisticated. And in fact, I think in the design proposal I wrote that it might be a good idea to have of the individual clusters and between clusters, and use that to inform the DNS management portion of the federated service controller, which cluster, what the proximity between clusters was actually in terms of latency, bandwidth, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly existing, I think Shashi actually brought that up in the document. So there are existing solutions, AWS, there are existing GSLB, so global server load balancing solutions that are based on DNS, either through AWS or actually Infoblox. We do it in our product. But basically, that's another programmable piece you need to do, which isn't necessarily a big deal. But the idea of pulling it into into the core DNS itself for us is that we can, like I said, go to these external policy engines, and then those policy engines can do more advanced policies than necessarily you could easily do in the traditional GSLB type of thing. So I know Torin in the past gave a demonstration of cluster placement using Open Policy Agent, where you decided, say, that you needed to place these things in the EU cluster. You could do the same thing, sort of regulatory type of policies, where your DNS redirection goes through that same set of policies, and then it will only select clusters that are compliant with whatever you're doing. I think that would be pretty much that would be quite difficult to do in the existing cloud DNS providers, because of the maybe you could do it setting up some complex set of records, but I would think you would need to more naturally, it would be done by the DNS lookup itself, which may not provide that level of refinement.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we don't need to go into the detail now. I think it could, equally easily be done in the other solution. And I'm not, to be clear, I'm not actually hanging on to the existing solution just because it's there or because I wrote it. But I think the fairly obvious downside of the one in this document, the proposed solution in this document, is the kind of catastrophic failure scenario where you can quite easily and conceivably take down the internal DNS of all of the clusters. And it's weighing that up against the benefits that it provides, which, and how many of those benefits could not be provided in a safer way. And to be clear, I don't actually have any objection to anybody working on the proposal as it stands at the moment and having it as an optional, deployment possibility. But I do think that the downsides are very substantial, and I think I added those to the comments, and the upsides are beneficial, but not enough to justify the downsides. particularly if we were to add those benefits, for example, improving the nearness algorithm to I think it would be better. The end result there would be better than the end result here because of the catastrophic failure problems and scalability problems.
That's fair. I mean, I think,
I think everybody can decide for themselves which of the two trade-offs they prefer.
right, exactly. Yeah, I think we can offer it as an option. We may have to refine it somewhat, but if we can offer it as an option, then people will make their choices based upon those constraints.
Yeah, another great thing about this proposal is it doesn't require any changes to Federation service controller or like any Federation changes. All the code changes would be in core DNS.
Yes, unless we decide to make it an option that's sort of simple. Although I did see there was one PR being debated about whether DNS provider is mandatory or not. So probably if you were running this, you wouldn't want to run a DNS provider. But other than that, very minor, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily need any changes. Although to make it really convenient, it would be nice to have some.
Yep.
I mean, I think to the earlier discussion, this also could be separated from the control plane entirely, because the only tie right now, as it's written, is the watch on the cluster object. It needs to be made aware of the cluster objects, which means that either you need a central place to do that, which certainly makes the most sense, or if people don't want to run that separate controller, then they can manually, I don't know why they'd want to do that, but they can manually add the clusters as they bring up new clusters. So I'd be curious to see what those specific DNS service discovery, federated service discovery use cases were that were discussed earlier, and see where those fit in with either this proposal or something else we might be able to do in core DNS.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I'd just like to echo there was 3 or 4 different concerns about I think lack of closure based on the previous discussion and where the SIG wants to go from here. So again, in terms of API, we got a little bit of input from Maru this time, more the previous times. Certainly there's different, everybody has their own reasons for being in this SIG. The class of, I guess, users who have to deliver a solution to end users, I think that bucket of API issues that would be more core or foundational definitely needs to have more attention within this SIG. On top of that, I think we're layering the aspect of the fact that we have customers who have problems and solutions they want solved today and probably can't wait for this investment to be completed. I see, I don't think any of these core foundational issues can be solved within the next few quarters. It's more of a long-term kind of thing. So I guess what I'd propose is, or maybe it's just an ask, is if despite the name SIG Federation, do we want to take up multi-cluster discussions if they come under the form of tooling or any other form that is not strictly Federation API? And if so, are we going to make room for them in the agenda?
I'm definitely in support of sort of expanding the scope to be multi-cluster. I think the only concern is that it's not just enough to say we're going to talk about this or we're going to, have room for it. I think it's more that we've been very focused on kind of federating applications. It's kind of how I view like the existing solution. And that's like in itself is like a huge mission. And so if we're going to expand the scope, we have to find a way we have to decrease the amount of work involved in maintaining the application federation solution, or we won't have any resources to do anything else.
Yeah,
or we need more people. I mean, that's another option, but.
Just to follow on to that, Maru, I mean, it sounds kind of like what's being proposed is right now, Federation is a very prescriptive approach to solving a multi-cluster issue. So if we sort of be less prescriptive and say, look, it's just multi-cluster and or Federation, but at the same time, reduce the types of use cases we're going after. Is that sort of what's being proposed?
I think that's, at least on the short term, that's the only way to make the problem tractable. So I would agree, yes.
And I guess maybe it just ties into prioritization. I mean, we're still going to have, I mean, any successful software effort always has an endless amount of backlog. And what you actually accomplish is based on which things bubble to the top and actually get the attention. So I think as the SIG tries to approach other use cases that it hasn't been approaching in the past, it's just like if people are interested in working on those, that's probably likely to take precedence over anything else. It's just, I mean, this does represent like a fairly substantial shift. And I mean, what are we going to do for the existing stuff? Are we going to focus on other things to the exclusion of that? Are we ever going to get to GA on some of this stuff? Like, I think we have a lot of discussion. I mean, this is kind of like a general strategy. I'm in agreement, but I think we have a lot more discussion before we actually move forward.
Okay. Anybody from Wale or Quentin, you still around?
It feels like this obviously isn't something we can make, I think, real, concrete, detailed decisions about today. I think at this point, going forward from here, with this in mind, we kind of all need to assess, like, well, what are the use cases that are a concern? Like, what is it particular? Like, I think individually, separately, it's good to think about these things too, rather than just in the group. And maybe we come back next week with people have more fully formed out ideas, have thought more about this, have sort of let this sit and looked at the use cases and looked and thought about Federation in this context. I think it will become more obvious, like, how this will be divided up and like what sort of actual like structural and mandate and organizational changes are necessary to help us get that done. Right now, this still feels kind of too new to really make big decisions like that.
Well, I mean, it's not a matter of making big decisions so much as it's having a conversation and sort of getting to a consensus on what we're trying to accomplish, and then we can focus on how we, do that. But I really don't think that that's something we can accomplish with an hour a week. I agree that there has to be, individual sort of contemplation of these issues, but there's no way we're going to evolve from what we have today to sort of the future we're proposing based on just random conversation. Like, there has to be a really focused effort. I mean, in an ideal case, we would actually have people in a room, for a day or two or more and like hashing this stuff out. That could be logistically difficult to arrange. I understand that. But in the absence of that, maybe we need to have other means of having focused discussion.
Right. I mean, to the list you had, Maru, it's pretty intimidating. Even though it's all under 1.8, we, even from our side, we can't fully staff that.
Well, I mean, I think that some of those issues that I sort of put on 1.8 were kind of presuming business as usual, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. And so I'm like, I agree with the staffing issues. If we're going to scale this down, or we're going to sort of have a more focused effort that actually can deliver like supportable features or capabilities, then there needs to be like determination of what the most important things that we could, what are the most important things? How do we break them up into pieces that are actually going to be like deliverable in 1.8 or 1.9 or wherever, and how are we going to resource that? And also, the list of priorities doesn't really include today any of the, like, the work to break things out so that customers can consume them without sort of buying into the control plane as it exists today. So that's a whole other category of work we haven't even touched on. So like I said, I think like having hard conversations about like what can we reasonably achieve, what do we want to achieve, and what we want to achieve can we reasonably expect to do in 1.8, and how do we do that? Like I said, this is like I think we were talking internally about this at Red Hat, and Steve Watt mentioned that like SIG storage was having issues last year around like focus and like delivering in a timely fashion, and they basically just had like an intensive like on-site to try to nail things down. Maybe Steve, you can provide more detail about that.
Yeah, sure. So basically, you know, Sod, Ollie, Tim Hawken, myself, and a few other folks, we basically just got in a room, and the first thing we did is talk about use cases. And then, you know, at a high level, like, what are we trying to do? Okay, we're trying to do multi-cluster, single cloud provider. Great. What does that actually mean? Like, what are the limitations? What works? What doesn't? Lay it out. And from there, figure out what our strategic approach is. So it seems like we've got general consensus around things like, okay, we want to do multi-cluster, single cloud provider, multi-region. But then, you know, a clear list of like, what we want to go after within that, and specifically what isn't, might be useful to do a face-to-face, and then use that as the strategic direction. Like, and you know, we're not going to use Federation, or we are, or you know, something to that effect.
So I mean, we're kind of out of time for this meeting, so I'm not really expecting us to come to some sort of conclusion. But I do think we should probably follow up like this week. Because I guess, like in my mind, you know, any sort of energy or enthusiasm for continuing to work on the existing solution is pretty greatly diminished if I'm uncertain as to whether it's going to be viable or whether, you know, the effort put in is going to be useful to anybody. I'm assuming that other people feel the same way. Feel free to chime in if that's not the case. But I think like we're in this position where, okay, we're going to change direction, and now, you know, we're kind of stalled, and now we have to actually map out a new direction so we can start moving in that way. So the sooner we do it, the better. The longer we wait, like the worse it is for everybody involved, I think. So can we, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't really, to me, it's not, I don't really ever have a precedent. I haven't been involved in Cube that long. Maybe SIG storage is the only example we have, but can we maybe on the mailing list figure out another time to meet and just map out a strategy for like discussing this? And it doesn't have to be solve the world. It just has to be what concrete steps can we take, whether it be, you know, a series of, you know, video conferences or something, just to start walking in this new direction with consensus from the stakeholders involved.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is having maybe people from other SIGs join would be helpful, because every time we try to make progress on, especially things that have to do with identities, policy, these are hard problems. And I mean, never mind the backlog and the foundational issues, these are things that, whether you're Federation API or not, if you have a tenable multi-cluster strategy, you have to tackle them. So, and right now they don't show up pretty much anywhere on the spreadsheet. So I'd like those to be part of the discussion too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So action item, Christian, can you please like work on scheduling another meeting and just get consensus on the SIG as to when it should be, and try to sort of nail down what we actually want to accomplish? Because I mean, there's lots of stuff to talk about, and you know, there's a certain amount of emotion around it, I'm sure, from people who've been participating, but we really need to focus and just make decisions on what next steps to take.
Okay. Is there a time that works for everybody? Is it fair to restrict, I see at least mostly seems to be US based, everybody who spoke today?
We can use our next SIG meeting to do this.
next well, Maru was asking for this week, which is.
I mean, if it's not possible to
there's-
do it, that's fine. I'm just kind of concerned that like we're going to lose momentum if we don't we don't sort of unblock people from working on stuff. Because, like I said,
Yeah.
it's unclear in the mind as whether we should be working on the stuff that's currently in flight.
I mean, just as an example with SIG storage, right? We were locked in a room for 4 days, going until 6 p.m. to sort the shit out, right? So it's, 1 hour meeting is not really going to help much. It's
Yeah, I agree. And also next Tuesday is Independence Day in the US. So next Tuesday there's no SIG meeting, and we can move it to Wednesday. We're also Google's off on Monday and Tuesday, so we will either have to decide to move next week's meeting or cancel.
Okay. How about Friday,
This Friday?
No, Thursday.
Thursday?
Yeah, Friday.
Or Thursday?
Yeah, no Friday, please.
Okay.
Since it's a long weekend, I expect many people will be out.
Yeah.
Okay, I can't make Thursday though. But
Well, I guess.
I'll set something up, or
We'll
I'll,
discuss on the mailing list.
yeah, on the mailing list. Okay,
All right.
that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.